It's not really surprising. Israel signed a letter to the American administration a couple of weeks ago because of a demand by a presidential decree by Biden about how it uses its weapons that it gets from the US according to international law. This letter has been sent to the Americans. The US is also supportive of Israel's war objectives. It is concerned of some issues, especially on Rafah. But generally speaking, I think the US stands by Israel. It's committed to its security, and Biden is playing along, especially at a time in which there is still negotiations for a ceasefire and in which there are attempts to coordinate a future Israeli operation in Rafah if such actually takes place.
I think you're correct in saying the United States is supporting an ally at war, no question there, but was this a missed opportunity for the US to use its leverage and apply specific conditions or restrictions on the use of these weapons? It seems like the United States is saying one thing and then doing another.
So in a way, the US put a condition in early February with a decree by the president, and Israel had to abide by it. And Israel submitted its response saying it is going according to the American conditions. The US apparently has to learn the Israel response. It has until May or so to do so. So before that process is completed, there is no justification, I think, from the American procedural side to track back on the commitments of the past. So if such a limitation or further limitation will be posed, I don't think it will be happening within the next couple of months, but rather later. And still, I think the Americans want to see the progress towards a pause in fighting and to reach understanding with Israel on Rafah. And I don't think the calculation is in Washington that such a step will be helpful for those goals.
Nimrod, can I get your reaction to the latest protests that we've seen on the ground at the weekend in Israel? It would seem at this point that Netanyahu's coalition is again on the brink of crisis on several issues, the latest, of course, being this ultra-Orthodox conscription issue. Is this ruling likely to cause any shifts in power within the current structure of the Israeli government? And how are you, I guess, viewing the reaction that we've seen on the ground to this issue?
So much changes have been happening in Israel since October 7, but there is one constant factor in which over 70% of the Israelis, month after month, want to see early election take place. They lost faith in the leadership of Netanyahu. Now, for several months, that was not coupled with concrete action on the streets because the mindset was so much focused on the war, on the consequences of it. But now things are changing. Last night, there was 100,000 people in the streets of Jerusalem next to the Knesset, building up a tent city that will be staying there for the entire week. There are political maneuvering already taking place by different actors within the political system. There are multiple crises that you mentioned. So all in all, Israel will be heading probably to early elections. We don't know how quick that will take. We just heard Netanyahu yesterday in his press conference saying this will be a dangerous thing for Israel because it will, according to him, will paralyze the country for half a year. But that's the prospects for change. Israelis are frustrated by the lack of achievements, by the lack of achievements of the war objectives. They hold Netanyahu responsible. They want a new leadership in place. And I think the process is moving. Again, it will take time. The Knesset is going to recess next week for almost a couple of months. So the process has still some length to go, but the direction, I think, is clear.
So you think it's pretty clear now that Israel could, in fact, be heading to an early election as a result of the situation we now see unfolding on the ground?
I think such a tragedy that Israel went through in October 7 and all that is happening since, I don't see a scenario, a realistic scenario in which the leadership of Israel will be unchanged. Now, we've seen that after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which was almost the closest tragedy that we saw to October 7. Then it took 4 years for leadership change to happen. I think it will be going quicker this time around. But again, we need to take into account the political timeline. Just from when the Knesset is dissolving until election, there will be at least 100 days after elections are being held in Israel. There are all kind of coalition bargaining. It means another 2 or 3 months. So in any case, we are talking about no earlier than 6 to 7 months from now to see any leadership change. And it might take even longer, definitely after the American election takes place. And anyone thinking about the day after in Gaza and what will happen needs to understand that Netanyahu will still be the one calling the shots for the next at least half a year.
Who is in the strongest position to challenge Netanyahu?
There is kind of a paradox, because if you look at the public opinion polls, you see that the Israelis are tilting to the right in terms of their perceptions, ideologies, ideas. but are preferring to go for a centrist party. Benny Gantz, the former chief of staff of the Israeli military, is gaining in the polls consecutively since the war began, but it's not necessarily that his power will stick until election day. So there will be all kinds of reconfiguration, I think, taking place within the Israeli political system. We probably will see another right-wing party being established, maybe Gideon Saar, maybe Naftali Bennett, maybe others. There is a renewal within the Israeli left. There is a kind of a battle for the space between Lapid and Gantz and who controls the Israeli center. So what we see now in the polls will not necessarily be the one that we'll see later on. I think a realistic scenario, and maybe a positive one, will be to aspire for kind of a broad ideological coalition in the day after Netanyahu, like we saw with the Lapid-Bennett coalition, which was mainly focused on good governance, on the national security interest, in trying to do good for the public. That is what Israelis really want now. I think a responsible leadership to take care after their interests, and it will help bring the country out of the crisis that it currently is.
Nimrod, just before I let you go, to round out the conversation, ceasefire talks continuing in Egypt as Israel continues to threaten a ground operation in Rafah. How do you expect those talks to unfold, and what's the next flashpoint that you're looking out for?
These talks are really important. I think part of the motivation that led people to the streets yesterday in Jerusalem was the understanding that the time for the hostages is running out. We hear news about hostages that are not alive anymore week after week. We need to get this deal done. The parameters are basically agreed upon. We're talking about a 6-week pause for the hostages to be released, all kind of humanitarian increased aid. This should be done. I think the Americans have put that as a goal of their diplomacy. President Biden was speaking about it. He was saying at the time that the ball is in Hamas court. We also know that Netanyahu has been stalling his process, and not many people are sure how much he's committed to that. That's the goal now, because once this pause is set up, you can move on with other diplomatic channels, including, by the way, on Lebanon, because there is a real threat of escalation going on over there. So this is the goal now. I think all the diplomatic efforts should be focused on that. We need to have a limited pause, at least to begin with, and then move forward. And even after that pause ends, probably there will be some Israel operation in Rafah. Netanyahu is clear about that. The goal will be to do so in a way that is coordinated with the Americans, that is coordinated with the Egyptians, that does not cross the red lines, and that make Israel go closer into its war objectives by not inflicting as much harm as possible to Palestinian civilian life, which is another big issue.